Months turned into years, and Marcus Thompson's legacy continued to grow. What had started as a single moment on live television had evolved into something far greater, a movement that transcended industries, communities, and generations. His name became synonymous with resilience, innovation, and the belief that everyone deserved a fair shot at success. Yet, despite the accolades and achievements, Marcus remained deeply connected to the values that had guided him since childhood: humility, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to helping others. One evening, Marcus found himself standing on stage at a prestigious awards gala, accepting the title of Entrepreneur of the Year. The room was filled with luminaries from every corner of the business world: CEOs, investors, philanthropists, all gathered to celebrate excellence in entrepreneurship. As he stepped up to the podium, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the grand ballroom. For a moment, Marcus paused, taking it all in. This wasn't just recognition for his company or his personal accomplishments. It was validation of the idea that success could be inclusive, compassionate, and transformative. "Thank you," Marcus began, his voice steady but warm. "This award isn't just about me. It's about every person who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. It's about my mother, who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and still found time to remind me that I could achieve anything I set my mind to. And it's about the countless small business owners, students, and dreamers out there fighting for their place in the world." He paused, scanning the room. The faces looking back at him were a mix of admiration, curiosity, and inspiration. Marcus knew this was his chance to leave them with something meaningful. Not just a speech, but a call to action. That moment on Morning Nation wasn't just about shutting down a TV host. He continued. It was about showing the world that we can confront ignorance with grace, strength, and truth. Success isn't handed to anyone. It's earned. But the system we live in doesn't always give everyone a fair shot. That's why we need to create opportunities for those who are often overlooked. We need to level the playing field not just for ourselves but for the next generation. The crowd erupted into applause again, many rising to their feet. Cameras flashed as journalists captured the moment, knowing that Marcus's words would resonate far beyond the walls of the gala. By the end of the night, clips of his acceptance speech were already trending online, sparking conversations about leadership, equality, and the responsibility of success. In the weeks following the gala, Marcus threw himself into new projects aimed at expanding his impact. He announced the launch of a memoir titled From Broken Computers to Building Dreams, detailing his journey from Chicago's South Side to becoming one of the most influential entrepreneurs in America. The book quickly climbed bestseller lists, praised for its raw honesty and practical advice. Readers connected with Marcus's vulnerability as he shared stories of failure, doubt, and perseverance. Teachers incorporated the memoir into classrooms, using it as a tool to inspire students to overcome adversity and pursue their passions. But writing the memoir wasn't just about telling his story. It was about creating a roadmap for others. At the end of each chapter, Marcus included exercises and reflection questions designed to help readers identify their strengths, set goals, and build confidence. He wanted the book to be more than a narrative. He wanted it to be a guide, a companion, for anyone navigating the challenges of life. As the memoir gained traction, Marcus also focused on scaling Paynova Tech's initiatives. The company launched a program called Tech for Tomorrow, which provided free coding workshops and mentorship opportunities to underserved youth across the country. Partnering with schools, libraries, and community centers, the initiative reached thousands of students, many of whom had never considered careers in technology before. Marcus traveled to these events whenever possible, speaking directly to the participants and encouraging them to dream big. "You don't have to look a certain way or come from a certain background to succeed in tech," he told a group of middle schoolers during one such workshop. "All you need is curiosity, determination, and a willingness to learn. If I can do it, so can you." His presence made a tangible difference. Students left these sessions energized, inspired to explore fields they'd previously thought were out of reach. Parents thanked Marcus for giving their children hope, while educators credited him with reigniting a passion for learning in students who had once been disengaged. Beyond education, Marcus expanded Paynova Tech's focus on economic empowerment. He spearheaded the creation of a nationwide coalition of minority-owned businesses, providing resources, networking opportunities, and access to capital. The coalition hosted annual summits where entrepreneurs shared strategies, celebrated successes, and collaborated on solutions to common challenges. These gatherings fostered a sense of community and solidarity, reminding participants that they weren't alone in their struggles. Marcus also partnered with policymakers to advocate for systemic change. He testified before Congress multiple times, urging lawmakers to support legislation that promoted diversity in entrepreneurship and addressed disparities in access to funding. His testimony was backed by data collected through Paynova Tech's research arm, which analyzed barriers faced by underrepresented groups in the business world. Lawmakers listened, introducing bills inspired by Marcus's recommendations. Some of these policies eventually became law, marking significant progress toward a more equitable economy. Despite his growing influence, Marcus remained grounded. He often returned to his roots, visiting the neighborhood where he grew up and reconnecting with the people who had shaped his early years. On weekends, he volunteered at local shelters, offering guidance to young adults trying to find their footing. He mentored aspiring entrepreneurs, sharing lessons learned from both his triumphs and failures. To Marcus, staying connected to his community was essential, not only because it kept him humble, but because it reminded him of why he did what he did. As the years passed, Marcus's story became part of the cultural fabric. Schools taught his journey in history classes alongside other trailblazers who had challenged societal norms. Documentaries and biopics chronicled his rise, showcasing how one man's determination had sparked a movement. Even late-night comedians joked about pulling a Marcus Thompson when faced with tough situations, a testament to how deeply his message had permeated popular culture. Yet Marcus never saw himself as a hero. To him, he was simply someone who had refused to let circumstances define him. In interviews, he often emphasized that his success wasn't unique. It was attainable for anyone willing to put in the effort. "I'm no different from anyone else," he said during a sit-down with a major news network. "I've just been blessed with opportunities and surrounded by people who believed in me. My goal is to pay that forward, to make sure others have the same chances I did." By the time Marcus reached his 50s, his impact was undeniable. Paynova Tech had revolutionized the way small businesses operated, empowering millions of entrepreneurs worldwide. His advocacy work had driven policy changes that opened doors for marginalized communities. And his story had inspired countless individuals to chase their dreams no matter how impossible they seemed. Looking back on his journey, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had faced obstacles that might have broken others, yet he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The boy who once fixed broken computers in his mother's apartment had grown into a man whose innovations touched lives around the globe. But perhaps the greatest measure of his success wasn't the wealth he accumulated or the awards he received. It was the lives he transformed along the way. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Marcus sat in his backyard, sipping coffee and flipping through old photo albums. Pictures of his mother smiled back at him, her eyes filled with pride. He thought about the sacrifices she had made, the lessons she had taught him, and the love that had carried him through the darkest days. Tears welled up in his eyes as he whispered, "I did it, Mom. I made you proud." And he had, not just because he had built a successful company or become a household name, but because he had stayed true to the values she had instilled in him. He had used his platform to lift others up, to challenge systems of inequality, and to prove that resilience could light the way even in the darkest of times. Marcus knew that his work wasn't done. There would always be more barriers to break, more dreams to nurture, and more battles to fight. But as he closed the photo album and gazed out at the horizon, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after he was gone. And that, he realized, was the true definition of success. Not what you achieved for yourself, but what you left behind for others. Years later, when historians wrote about this era, they would remember Marcus Thompson not just as an entrepreneur or a public figure, but as a catalyst for transformation. A man who had taken a single moment of adversity and turned it into a lifetime of advocacy. A man who had shown the world that courage, authenticity, and compassion could move mountains and leave a legacy that endured for generations to come. The silence in the coffee shop was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of someone nervously adjusting their chair. Marcus sat motionless for a few seconds, his dark eyes locked onto Cheryl's icy glare. His mind raced, sifting through possible responses. Should he ignore her completely? Walk away without acknowledging the insult? Or should he confront her head-on, matching her aggression with equal force? Each option flickered through his thoughts like scenes from a movie, but none felt quite right. Cheryl, meanwhile, stood firm, her arms still crossed tightly across her chest. A smug smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she watched Marcus struggle to respond. To her, this moment wasn't just about making a statement, it was about asserting dominance. She wanted him to feel small, insignificant, unworthy of occupying the same space as her. And judging by the way he hesitated, she believed she'd succeeded. The longer the silence stretched, the more confident she became, her smirk growing wider with every passing second. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. Beneath the surface, his mind was working overtime. He knew that reacting impulsively, snapping back with anger or sarcasm, would only escalate the situation. It would give Cheryl exactly what she wanted: chaos, attention, and validation for her hateful words. On the other hand, staying silent might seem weak, as though he accepted her insult without challenge. No, Marcus realized, he needed something different. Something unexpected. Something that would not only disarm Cheryl, but also make everyone else in the room think twice about their own biases. Taking a deep breath, Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His movements were deliberate, measured, exuding a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He looked up at Cheryl again, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her falter for just a fraction of a second. For the first time since she'd approached him, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, a crack in her armor of arrogance. "Ma'am," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. "I'm curious, have you ever been to Africa?" The question caught Cheryl off guard, her eyebrows furrowed and her mouth opened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to engage her at all. Before she could answer, Marcus continued, his tone polite but probing. "Because when you tell me to go back to Africa, it sounds like you're sending me somewhere you don't actually know anything about." Cheryl stammered, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning. That's not the point," she snapped, trying to regain control of the conversation. But Marcus wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair now, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as though he were delivering a lecture rather than responding to a personal attack. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to command the room's full attention, "it is the point. You see, Africa isn't one country. It's a continent, a vast, diverse, incredible place filled with over 50 countries, thousands of languages, and countless cultures. It's home to ancient civilizations, groundbreaking innovations, and breathtaking beauty. Yet here you are, telling me to go back to somewhere you probably couldn't even find on a map." The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the cafe like ripples on water. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others exchanged glances, silently processing what they were hearing. Cheryl's face flushed red, partly from embarrassment and partly from frustration. She clenched her jaw, struggling to come up with a rebuttal. But Marcus wasn't finished. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "And let's talk about history for a second," he added, his tone still calm but laced with conviction. "Africa is where humanity itself began. Every single person in this room, every human being on this planet, can trace their ancestry back to Africa. So technically, we're all African in some way." He gestured around the cafe, his hands moving slowly to emphasize his point. But somehow people like you forget that part of the story. Instead, you use phrases like "go back to Africa" as insults, as weapons, without realizing how ignorant they sound. By now, the entire room was hanging on his every word. Even those who had initially seemed indifferent were leaning forward, captivated by the exchange. Cheryl, however, looked increasingly flustered. Her earlier confidence had crumbled under Marcus's composed demeanor and razor-sharp logic. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she found herself at a loss. Marcus took advantage of the pause, softening his tone slightly. "You know, I understand why comments like yours sting. They're meant to hurt. They're rooted in fear and misunderstanding. But instead of feeding into that negativity, maybe we should focus on learning from each other. Maybe we should ask questions, seek understanding, and challenge our assumptions. Because honestly, none of us truly belong anywhere if we can't coexist with respect and empathy." As he spoke these final words, Marcus's gaze swept across the room, connecting briefly with several patrons. There was the young barista, nodding almost imperceptibly behind the counter. A middle-aged man in a plaid shirt, who had been scrolling on his phone moments earlier, now looked thoughtful. Even a teenage girl sitting near the door stopped texting long enough to listen intently. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted, entirely, from tense and awkward to reflective and charged with possibility. Cheryl, on the other hand, looked like a cornered animal. Her cheeks burned brighter than ever, and her hands twitched nervously at her sides. She tried once more to interrupt, blurting out, "This doesn't change anything." But her voice lacked its earlier venom. It wavered, betraying the cracks in her bravado. Marcus simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that conveyed both patience and resolve. "I think it does," he replied softly, his words landing like a feather, but carrying the weight of a boulder. Change starts with conversations like this. It starts with challenging ideas that divide us and replacing them with ones that bring us together. So thank you, ma'am, for giving me the opportunity to share my perspective. Whether you realize it or not, you've already sparked something important today." With that, Marcus picked up his espresso cup and took another sip, signaling that the conversation was over. At least for him. Cheryl stood frozen for a moment longer, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, unable to bear the weight of the room's collective judgment any longer, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the cafe eerily quiet once again. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. Everyone remained frozen in place, absorbing what had just unfolded. Slowly, the spell broke. Someone near the front of the room clapped, softly, tentatively. Another person joined in, then another, until scattered applause filled the space. Marcus raised a hand to acknowledge the gesture, his expression calm but grateful. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about planting seeds of understanding in fertile ground. And judging by the looks on the faces around him, those seeds had taken root. The applause began softly, almost hesitantly, as if the patrons were unsure whether clapping was appropriate in this moment. But soon it grew louder, more confident, spreading through the cafe like a wave. Marcus raised a hand again, gently, waving it to signal that he didn't need or want the attention. His expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. Pride not for himself, but for the fact that the room had responded to reason and understanding rather than anger. He knew that moments like these, however fleeting, could leave a lasting impact. As the clapping subsided, Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking another sip of his espresso. The warmth of the drink seemed to ground him, reminding him of why he did what he did every day, to educate, to inspire, and to challenge people to see beyond their own biases. He glanced around the room, noticing how the mood had shifted entirely. Gone was the tension that had gripped the space just moments earlier. In its place was an air of reflection, a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had happened. Here, a young woman seated at a nearby table caught his eye. She couldn't have been older than 25, with curly brown hair and glasses perched on her nose. Her laptop was open in front of her, but she wasn't typing anymore. Instead, She stared at Marcus, her face a mixture of admiration and curiosity. After a few seconds, she mustered the courage to speak. "That was incredible," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "How do you stay so calm when someone says something like that to you?" Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating the question. It wasn't one he heard often, at least not phrased quite this way. Most people assumed his composure came naturally, but the truth was far more complicated. "It's not easy," he admitted, setting his cup down and turning slightly toward her. "Believe me, I feel the same frustration and hurt anyone else would in that situation. But over time, I've learned that reacting with anger usually doesn't change minds. People dig their heels in and double down on their beliefs. What works better is showing them a different perspective, one they might not have considered before." The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "Still," she said, "you handled it so well. Like, you turned her own argument against her." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe, as others nearby chimed in with similar sentiments. One man in his 50s wearing a worn leather jacket leaned forward from his seat across the aisle. "You really put her in her place," he said, chuckling dryly. "I bet she won't forget that anytime soon." Marcus chuckled, too, though his laughter carried a note of sadness. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," he explained. "My goal isn't to make people feel bad, it's to make them think. If even one person walks away from this conversation questioning their assumptions, then it's worth it." He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, "Besides, Cheryl wasn't wrong about one thing. I am connected to Africa. We all are. And acknowledging that connection can be a powerful starting point for conversations about race, identity, and belonging." His comment sparked further discussion. Another patron, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, spoke up. "You know, I've never thought about it like that," she admitted. "When people say things like, 'Go back to where you came from,' they're usually talking about immigrants or minorities. But what you said earlier, about Africa being the cradle of humanity, it makes you realize how ridiculous those statements really are." Marcus nodded, encouraged by her insight. "Exactly," he said. "Those kinds of comments aren't just hurtful, they're historically inaccurate. African Americans didn't choose to come here. We were brought here against our will. Our ancestors built this country with their labor, their sweat, and their blood. Yet somehow, we're still treated like outsiders. That's the real tragedy." The woman sighed deeply, shaking her head. "It's heartbreaking, honestly. And it's frustrating because so many people don't even realize how much history they don't know. They repeat these phrases without thinking about where they came from or who they're hurting." At this, Marcus leaned forward again, his tone becoming more animated. "That's why education is so important," he said. "Not just learning facts and dates, but understanding the stories behind them, the human stories. When you hear about slavery or segregation or systemic racism, it's easy to distance yourself from it, to think of it as something that happened in the past. But the effects are still here, shaping our lives every single day. Until we confront that reality, we can't move forward." His words resonated deeply with the group. Even those who hadn't initially participated in the conversation were now listening intently, nodding along or scribbling notes on napkins. The atmosphere in the cafe had transformed completely. It was no longer just a place to grab coffee. It had become a space for dialogue, for growth, for connection. But as the discussion continued, Marcus couldn't help but glance toward the door Cheryl had stormed out of. He wondered where she was now, what she was thinking. Had his words reached her? Or had she retreated further into her beliefs, doubling down on her prejudices? These questions lingered in the back of his mind, not out of bitterness, but out of genuine concern. Despite everything, he hoped that Cheryl would take a moment to reflect, not just on what he'd said, but on why she'd felt the need to say what she did in the first place. Eventually, the conversation wound down, and the patrons returned to their respective activities. The barista resumed making drinks, the hum of the espresso machine filling the room once again. Marcus closed his laptop and gathered his belongings, preparing to leave. As he stood up, several people approached him to shake his hand or thank him for sharing his thoughts. He accepted their gratitude graciously, knowing that the real work lay ahead. Before stepping outside, Marcus took one last look around the cafe. The energy in the room felt lighter now, as though a weight had been lifted. Conversations buzzed softly in the background, punctuated by laughter and the occasional burst of enthusiasm. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel hopeful. Change wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it started with moments like this. Moments where people listened, learned, and chose to see the world differently. With that thought in mind, Marcus pushed open the door and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The street was busy, filled with cars honking and pedestrians rushing to their next destination. Yet amid the chaos, Marcus walked with purpose, his step steady and sure. He knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but today at least, he'd planted a seed. And sometimes, that was enough. As Marcus stepped out of the coffee shop, the cool breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby park. The contrast between the charged atmosphere inside the cafe and the calmness of the outdoors was striking. For a moment he stood still, letting the fresh air fill his lungs and clear his mind. He replayed the events of the past hour in his head. The confrontation with Cheryl, the crowd's reaction, the unexpected applause, and felt a mix of emotions swirling within him: pride, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of responsibility. Walking. Down the sidewalk, Marcus noticed a young couple sitting on a bench near the entrance of the cafe. They looked to be in their late 20s, dressed casually but neatly. The man had a sketch pad resting on his lap while the woman held a cup of coffee in her hands. Something about them caught Marcus's attention, not because they were doing anything unusual, but because they seemed so ordinary. Their presence reminded him that racism wasn't always loud or overt. Sometimes it lurked quietly in the background, disguised as indifference or ignorance. It was the kind of prejudice that didn't make headlines but still shaped lives in profound ways. The couple glanced up as Marcus passed by, their eyes meeting his briefly. The man smiled warmly, nodding in acknowledgement while the woman gave a small wave. Marcus returned the gesture, appreciating the simple act of kindness. But as he continued walking, he couldn't help but wonder what they truly thought about what had happened inside the cafe. Did they agree with him? Or did they see Cheryl's comments as justified, even if unspoken? These questions lingered in his mind, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood how deeply ingrained biases could be. A few blocks away, Marcus decided to take a detour through the park. It was one of his favorite spots in the neighborhood, a sprawling green space dotted with towering oak trees, winding paths, and benches tucked under shady canopies. Children laughed as they chased each other around the playground, while joggers weaved through the trails, their earbuds firmly in place. The serenity of the park offered Marcus a chance to reflect further on the day's events. He found an empty bench near a small pond and sat down, watching ducks paddle lazily across the water. As he observed the scene before him, his thoughts drifted back to Cheryl. What had driven her to say what she did? Was it fear, ignorance, a desperate need to assert control? Marcus had encountered countless people like her over the years, individuals who clung to outdated ideas and resisted change at all costs. Yet despite their hostility, he never saw them as irredeemable. Everyone, he believed, had the capacity to grow if they were willing to listen. That's when it hit him. Maybe Cheryl had listened. Maybe, just maybe, his words had planted a seed in her mind, no matter how small. After all, change rarely happened overnight. It was often slow, incremental, and messy. People didn't wake up one morning suddenly enlightened. They arrived at understanding through a series of moments, conversations, and experiences that challenged their worldview. And today, Marcus realized, might have been one of those moments for Cheryl. But what about the others? The patrons in the cafe who had watched the exchange unfold? What impact would it have on them? Marcus knew that witnessing such a confrontation could go either way. Some might walk away inspired, ready to examine their own beliefs and behaviors. Others might dismiss it entirely, brushing it off as someone else's problem. Still, there was a third group, the ones who weren't sure what to think yet, the ones whose minds were teetering on the edge of transformation. Those were the people Marcus cared about most. If he could reach even one of them, if he could inspire them to question their assumptions and seek understanding, then his efforts were worthwhile. Lost in thought, Marcus barely noticed the elderly man approaching him until the man spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Marcus looked up to see a tall, slender figure standing beside the bench. The man appeared to be in his 70s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a navy blue blazer draped over his shoulders. His expression was kind, though his eyes carried a hint of curiosity. "Yes?" Marcus replied, gesturing for the man to sit down. The man obliged, lowering himself carefully onto the bench. "I saw what happened back there," he began, nodding toward the direction of the cafe. "You handled that situation beautifully." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Thank you, but I'm just glad it turned into a teachable moment. That's all I ever aim for, to get people thinking." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you certainly succeeded. I've lived in this neighborhood for decades, and I've seen my fair share of, let's call them, difficult interactions. But yours was different. You didn't stoop to her level. You rose above it." "I try," Marcus said simply. "It's not always easy, though. Sometimes it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle." "It does," the man agreed. "But every now and then you win a small victory, and those victories add up." He paused, glancing at the pond, where the ducks were now quacking loudly. "You know, I used to teach history at the local high school. One of my favorite lessons was about the origins of humanity, how we all trace our roots back to Africa. Students were always fascinated by that. They'd come in thinking history started with Greece or Rome, and then they'd realize it went much deeper than that." Marcus smiled, recognizing the parallel to his earlier conversation. "Exactly. When you frame things in terms of shared humanity, it becomes harder to cling to divisions. We're all connected whether we want to admit it or not." "Precisely," the man said, pointing a finger at Marcus as if to emphasize the point. "And that's why what you did today matters. You reminded everyone in that room, not just Cheryl, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. That's powerful stuff." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the ducks and enjoying the peacefulness of the park. Eventually, the man stood up, adjusting his blazer. "Anyway, I won't keep you any longer. Just wanted to say thank you for standing up, for speaking your truth, and for reminding us all of what really matters." Marcus extended his hand, which the man shook warmly. "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for taking the time to share your perspective. Conversations like this are important too." As the man walked away, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This encounter, brief though it was, reinforced why he did what he did. Every interaction, whether it was with Cheryl, the patrons in the cafe, or the elderly stranger in the park, was an opportunity to plant another seed, to nudge someone closer to understanding. Change didn't happen in grand gestures. It happened in these small, everyday moments. By the time Marcus left the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the streets. The golden light bathed the city in warmth, softening the edges of buildings and creating a serene backdrop for his journey home. As he walked, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope, not for himself but for the world around him. Yes, there was still work to be done. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging. But if today had taught him anything, it was that progress was possible. One conversation, one insight, one person at a time. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, the sky had turned a deep shade of indigo, dotted with the first few stars of the evening. The city lights flickered softly in the distance, casting a warm glow through his living room window as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Kicking off his shoes, he dropped his bag on the couch and headed straight for the kitchen. He needed something to unwind. A cup of tea, perhaps, or maybe just a moment of quiet reflection. As the kettle began to whistle, filling the small space with its comforting sound, Marcus leaned against the counter and let his thoughts drift back to the day's events. The confrontation at the coffee shop felt both distant and vivid, like a scene from a movie he'd watched years ago but couldn't quite forget. He replayed Cheryl's words in his mind, her sharp tone, her dismissive glare, and marveled at how such a brief interaction could leave such a lasting impression. But it wasn't just Cheryl who lingered in his thoughts. It was the crowd, the strangers who had witnessed the exchange, and even the elderly man in the park. Each person had reacted differently, revealing glimpses of their own beliefs, fears, and humanity. Marcus knew that moments like these were rare opportunities, not just to challenge others, but to learn about himself and the world around him. As he sipped his chamomile tea, Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through social media. It didn't take long for him to realize that news of the incident had already spread far beyond the confines of the cafe. Someone had recorded part of the exchange, a shaky video capturing Cheryl's angry declaration and Marcus's calm rebuttal, and posted it online. Within hours it had gone viral, sparking heated discussions across platforms. Comments poured in from all sides. Some praised Marcus for his poise and eloquence, while others defended Cheryl, accusing him of picking a fight or making everything about race. The range of reactions was predictable, yet exhausting, a reminder of how polarized society had become. One comment, however, stood out among the rest. It was written by a young woman named Sarah, who described herself as a college student studying sociology. Her words were thoughtful and measured, reflecting on how Marcus's response had made her reconsider her own biases. "I've always thought of myself as open-minded," she wrote, "but reading this thread has shown me how much I still don't know. I want to do better, to listen more, to question my assumptions, and to stand up when I see injustice." Marcus stared at the screen, feeling a surge of gratitude. For every hateful comment or dismissive remark, there were voices like Sarah's, people willing to engage, to grow, to change. These were the individuals who gave him hope, the ones who reminded him why he continued to speak out despite the challenges. He bookmarked Sarah's post, intending to reply later, and set his phone aside. The next morning, Marcus woke up early, as he usually did, and headed to the community center where he worked. Located in a bustling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, the center served as a hub for local residents, offering everything from after-school programs for kids to job training workshops for adults. Today, Marcus was scheduled to lead a discussion group focused on racial equity and inclusion. As he walked into the building, he greeted the staff and volunteers warmly, exchanging updates about upcoming projects and events. When it was time for the session to begin, Marcus took his seat at the front of the room, facing a diverse group of participants. Some were longtime attendees, familiar faces eager to dive deeper into the topics they'd explored in previous meetings. Others were newcomers, drawn by curiosity or a desire to understand the issues shaping their community. Marcus started by sharing a brief overview of the day's agenda, then paused, looking around the room. "I want to start with a question," he said, his voice steady and inviting. "How many of you have ever been told, or heard someone else, be told to go back somewhere? Maybe it was based on your ethnicity, your accent, or even the way you dress. Raise your hand if this has happened to you." To his surprise, nearly every hand in the room went up. A few people exchanged glances, nodding silently in solidarity. Marcus nodded too, acknowledging the weight of their shared experiences. "It's a common phrase," he continued, "but it carries a lot of meaning. When someone tells us to go back, they're not just questioning our presence, they're denying our belonging. They're saying we don't fit into their idea of what's normal or acceptable." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But here's the thing. Belonging isn't something that can be granted or taken away by someone else. It's something we claim for ourselves. And when we stand firm in who we are, when we refuse to shrink or disappear, we send a powerful message that we're here to stay, and we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, followed by applause. One participant, a middle-aged woman named Maria, raised her hand to speak. "What you said yesterday at the cafe, it really resonated with me. she began, referring to the now famous video. "I grew up hearing those kinds of comments and I used to believe them. I thought maybe I didn't belong here. But seeing you respond the way you did, it made me realize that I'm not alone, that none of us are alone." Her words struck a chord with the group, prompting others to share their own stories. A teenage boy talked about being teased at school for his accent, while an older man recounted being denied service at a restaurant because of the color of his skin. Each story added another layer to the conversation, weaving together a tapestry of resilience and strength. Marcus listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or observations, but mostly allowing the participants to guide the discussion. Toward the end of the session, Marcus posed one final question. If you could change one thing about the way people talk about race, what would it be? Answers varied widely, ranging from less defensiveness to more empathy, but one response stood out. It came from a young woman named Priya, who had been quiet for most of the meeting. "I think we need to stop treating racism as a problem that only affects certain groups," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not just black people or brown people who suffer, it's everyone. Because when we divide ourselves, we lose sight of what connects us, and that hurts us all." The room fell silent, the weight of Priya's words hanging in the air. Marcus smiled, feeling a swell of pride for the courage it had taken her to speak up. "That's exactly right," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Racism doesn't just harm the people it targets, it harms society as a whole. It creates walls where there should be bridges, fear where there should be trust, and division where there should be unity. Breaking those barriers starts with conversations like this one, with listening, learning, and committing to doing better." As the session drew to a close, several participants approached Marcus to thank him for facilitating such a meaningful discussion. One man, a father of 2 young children, shook his hand firmly and said, "You're making a difference, Marcus. Keep going." His words stayed with Marcus long after the group dispersed, fueling his determination to keep pushing forward. Later that evening, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing notes for an upcoming presentation, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Sarah, the college student whose comment he'd bookmarked earlier. She had seen his reply and wanted to connect further, to ask questions, share insights, and continue the conversation. Marcus smiled as he typed out a response, grateful for the opportunity to mentor someone eager to grow. In that moment, surrounded by reminders of the day's triumphs and challenges, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But every story shared, every mind opened, and every heart touched brought him one step closer to the world he envisioned. A world built on understanding, compassion, and mutual respect. And that, he realized, was worth every ounce of effort. The following weeks passed in a blur for Marcus, filled with long days and even longer nights. The viral video of his encounter with Cheryl continued to circulate online, sparking debates across forums, news outlets, and social media platforms. What started as a single incident in a quiet coffee shop had snowballed into something much larger. A national conversation about race, identity, and belonging. For Marcus, the sudden attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. On one hand, it validated the importance of his work and amplified his message to audiences far beyond his local community. On the other hand, it brought scrutiny, criticism, and a level of visibility he hadn't anticipated. Despite the challenges, Marcus remained grounded. He knew that fame, or infamy, was fleeting, but the issues at its core were not. Every morning he woke up with the same determination, to use this moment as an opportunity to educate, inspire, and create meaningful change. Whether it was speaking at schools, appearing on podcasts, or writing op-eds for major publications, Marcus approached each task with the same calm resolve that had defined his response to Cheryl. His goal wasn't to be celebrated as a hero. It was to remind people that they had the power to challenge prejudice and build bridges in their own lives. One afternoon, Marcus received an email from a local television station inviting him to participate in a live panel discussion about racism and accountability. At first, he hesitated. Media appearances weren't his forte, and he worried about being misrepresented or reduced to a soundbite. But after some reflection, he accepted the invitation, recognizing the platform's potential to reach viewers who might otherwise never engage in such conversations. The day of the taping arrived quickly, and Marcus found himself seated alongside 3 other panelists: a professor of sociology, a journalist known for her coverage of racial justice issues, and, surprisingly, Cheryl Dawson herself. When Cheryl walked onto the set, Marcus felt a jolt of surprise and curiosity. She looked different from the woman he'd encountered in the cafe. Her usual air of arrogance was replaced by a nervous energy, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse as she took her seat. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Marcus offered a polite nod. Cheryl returned the gesture awkwardly before turning her attention to the host, who welcomed the audience and introduced the topic. The discussion began with a brief recap of the now infamous coffee shop incident, followed by questions aimed at exploring its broader implications. The professor spoke first, offering insights into the historical roots of phrases like "go back to where you came from" and how they perpetuated harmful stereotypes. Next, the journalist weighed in, highlighting recent examples of similar incidents and the societal patterns they revealed. When it was Cheryl's turn to speak, she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the bright studio lights. I don't think I handled things well that day," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I said things I shouldn't have, and I regret it." The confession caught everyone off guard, including Marcus. He watched as Cheryl struggled to articulate her thoughts, her face flushed with emotion. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened," she continued, "and I realized that my words weren't just hurtful, they were ignorant. I didn't know anything about Africa or its history, and instead of learning, I lashed out." Her admission was met with silence, the kind that comes when people aren't sure whether to applaud or question sincerity. Marcus leaned forward slightly, studying her expression. Was this genuine remorse, or was it an attempt to save face? Either way, he decided to respond with empathy rather than skepticism. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his tone measured but warm. "It takes courage to acknowledge your mistakes, especially publicly. I hope this is the start of a journey toward understanding, not just for you, but for anyone watching who might relate to your experience." Cheryl nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I've started attending workshops and reading books about race," she added. "It's overwhelming, but necessary. I want to do better." The rest of the panel unfolded with a mix of tension and hope. While some viewers praised Cheryl's willingness to confront her biases, others dismissed her apology as insincere or performative. Marcus understood both perspectives. He'd seen enough apologies over the years to know that actions mattered, more than words, but he chose to focus on the positive. If Cheryl's public acknowledgement encouraged even one person to examine their own behavior, then it was worth celebrating. After the taping ended, Marcus lingered backstage, sipping water, and reflecting on the experience. Cheryl approached him tentatively, her earlier confidence nowhere to be seen. "Marcus," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. What I said to you that day was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Marcus studied her, for a moment, searching for signs of authenticity. Finally, he extended his hand. "Apology accepted," he replied simply. "But remember, it's not just about apologizing, it's about changing. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep challenging yourself. That's how we move forward." Cheryl nodded, visibly relieved, and walked away. Watching her go, Marcus felt a sense of closure, not because he believed Cheryl had fully transformed overnight, but because he saw the possibility of redemption. People weren't defined solely by their worst moments. They were shaped by how they responded to them. In the months that followed, Marcus continued his advocacy work with renewed vigor. The viral incident had opened doors he hadn't imagined, connecting him with activists, educators, and allies across the country. Together, they organized events, launched initiatives, and created resources designed to foster dialogue and promote equity. Marcus also kept in touch with Sarah, the college student whose comment had touched him deeply. She became a mentee of sorts, eager to learn from his experiences and contribute to the movement in her own way. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this journey was seeing the ripple effects in everyday life. Strangers approached Marcus on the street to thank him for inspiring them to have difficult conversations with friends and family. Teachers reached out to share stories of using his example in their classrooms. Even Cheryl resurfaced occasionally, updating him on her progress and expressing gratitude for his patience during their fraught encounter. Through it all, Marcus remained humble, knowing that no single person could dismantle centuries of systemic injustice alone. Change required collective effort, sustained commitment, and countless small victories along the way. And while the road ahead was undoubtedly long, Marcus took solace in the knowledge that every step mattered. Every conversation, every act of courage, every moment of reflection brought society closer to a future rooted in compassion and understanding. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He thought about the young woman in the cafe who had applauded his response, the elderly man in the park who had shared wisdom, and even Cheryl, whose apology, however imperfect, had signaled a glimmer of growth. Each interaction, no matter how fleeting, had contributed to something greater than itself. In that moment, Marcus realized that the fight against racism wasn't just about confronting hate. It was about nurturing love. Love for humanity, love for connection, and love for the belief that everyone deserved to belong. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and listen, that belief would continue to shine brightly, even in the darkest of times.